There's a silence in the woods that isn't peaceful. It presses against your chest, fills your ears with whispers you can't hear. Daniel felt it now, as he crept along the fogged path, every step tentative, every breath a reminder that the world can be cruel. But sometimes, it's also merciful. Long ago, a German shepherd named Ranger had saved him. Loyal, sharp, and brave. Ranger had been more than a dog. He had been family. And then, he had vanished. Years passed. Memories faded. And yet, when the howl finally broke through the night, Daniel knew. Some bonds are impossible to break. Mira, the girl lost to the same men who had trapped Ranger, needed them both. And the hills, shrouded in fog, were filled with danger, betrayal, and secrets no one had dared confront. But the dog remembered, and that memory would become a force, driving them through fear, uncertainty, and the storm ahead. This story is about more than survival. It's about loyalty, about courage, about how love, pure, unyielding, unspoken, can guide us home even when all seems lost. Winter clung to Ironwood, Montana like a hand that refused to let go. Snow drifted in lazy sheets across the empty streets, muffling sound, turning the little town into a portrait of stillness. Houses huddled together under blankets of white, smoke curling from chimneys like whispers of life in a world that seemed otherwise frozen. On the edge of town, beyond the frost-bitten pines and the frozen creek, the cemetery sat in silence, its rows of stones jutting out of the snow like teeth. Officer Daniel Cross pulled his coat tighter as he walked the path that was half buried in drifts. At 38, the lines on his face looked older than they should. His eyes carried the tired weight of someone who had seen more endings than beginnings. Every crunch of his boots in the snow echoed too loudly in the quiet, as if the world were listening for him to break. He stopped in front of a modest stone. The granite was simple, grey against the white landscape, the lettering crisp and final. K9 Ranger, faithful partner, end of watch. Daniel crouched, brushing away a crust of snow that had settled overnight, his gloved hand trembling. The cold bit through the leather, but he kept wiping until the words were clean. His breath fogged in the air as he whispered, "Morning, partner." His voice cracked at the end. It always did. For a long moment, he just sat there on his heels, staring at the stone. There was nobody beneath it, only dirt and silence. Ranger had never come home, never been laid to rest. But the department had insisted on the memorial. They needed closure. The town needed something to visit, something to point to when people asked where the hero dog had gone. Closure. The word burned in Daniel's chest. Closure was a lie carved into stone. The snow around him shifted as a gust of wind howled through the cemetery, bending the skeletal trees. He closed his eyes, and the cold was replaced by the heat of memory. It had been fire, not snow, that swallowed Ranger. The flames had risen like monsters that night, an old cabin on the outskirts of Ironwood, filled with the stench of gasoline and the screams of trafficked children. Daniel remembered the choking smoke clawing down his throat, the orange glow consuming everything. Ranger had gone in first, like always. That was his nature, charging into danger when every instinct should have screamed to stay back. Daniel had followed, half blind, the roar of the fire drowning out every thought but one. Don't lose him. But then the roof cracked, a beam snapped, and the world turned into a storm of sparks and splintering wood. The last glimpse he had of Ranger was the shepherd's silhouette disappearing deeper into the inferno, chasing the cry of a child. And then the flames collapsed between them like a closing door. They never found a body, only ashes, only silence. Daniel opened his eyes. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, stinging with cold and grief. He placed a hand on the top of the stone, his glove leaving a smear of wetness. "I should have gone further," he whispered. I should have found you." The words dissolved into the wind. He spoke to them anyway, because the silence inside him was worse. That silence followed him everywhere. Into his empty house, through long patrols, in the still moments between sirens and reports. It was the silence of absence, of a voice and presence that had once filled every day. People thought grief was loud, a storm of sobbing and rage. For Daniel, grief was quiet. It was the space beside him in the squad car that no longer breathed. It was the house without the click of claws on hardwood floors. It was the way his hand still reached for a leash that wasn't there. He stayed crouched until his knees burned from the cold, until he felt the numb ache in his fingers despite the gloves. A crow cawed from a distant pine, a ragged sound that made the cemetery feel lonelier than before. Finally, Daniel straightened, pulling his scarf over his face, as if that could hide the ache beneath his skin. He looked down at the stone once more. "I'll keep coming back," he said softly, "until the silence stops." But even as he said it, he knew the silence never would. As he turned to leave, his boots crunching back toward the path, the wind carried the faintest creak. He froze. It wasn't the cry of a crow or the shifting of branches. It was softer, closer. He turned his head back toward the grave. Snow swirled lazily across the stone, settling in its etched letters. Something small stuck out of the drift at its base. At first, Daniel thought it was just a scrap of trash carried by the wind. But as he brushed away the snow with his boot, he saw color. Paper, damp and wrinkled, but stubbornly clinging to life. He bent down, tugging it free. It was a drawing. Crayons pressed hard into the paper, the wax bleeding in shaky strokes. A child's drawing. A German shepherd, rough but unmistakable, drawn in thick black and brown lines. Around the dog, jagged bars like a cage, and scrawled above in uneven, almost frantic letters, were 2 words. Still alive. Daniel's breath caught. The wind howled again, rattling the bare trees, but he didn't hear it. All he saw was the drawing, the words burning into him. His first thought was disbelief. Some cruel prank, maybe. Kids in town still talked about Ranger. Maybe one of them thought it would be funny. But no child in Ironwood had ever seen the shepherd in a cage. No one but him had seen the way Ranger had vanished into fire. He gripped the paper tighter, the waxy colors smearing under his gloves. His throat tightened, torn between the instinct to throw it away and the impossible spark that flared in his chest. Hope. Hope he thought he was buried under this very stone. Daniel staggered back a step, staring down at the stone again. The inscription gleamed through its dusting of snow. "Faithful partner, end of watch." His jaw clenched. If Ranger was alive, if there was even the smallest chance, then this stone was nothing more than a lie. The silence inside him cracked, just a little. And Daniel Cross, who had walked through fire once already, felt a question rise in him that he hadn't dared ask in a year. What if? Daniel stood in the frozen cemetery, his breath clouding in the air, the little scrap of paper trembling in his gloved hand. Snowflakes landed on the wrinkled page, melting into tiny droplets that bled the crayon lines into blurred smudges. He turned it toward the gray sky, as though the pale light might reveal some truth hiding beneath the wax. A German shepherd stared back at him from the page. Broad muzzle, pointed ears, body framed by uneven vertical bars. A cage, drawn by a child's hand. Above it, the words scrawled in heavy, frantic strokes, "Still alive." The phrase hit Daniel like a blow. His jaw clenched, and a tremor ran through him, but not from the cold. He shook his head once, almost violently, as if he could reject it outright. "No," he muttered. "No, this is nothing." A prank. That was the only explanation. Kids from town still whispered about Ranger. Maybe they'd been playing in the snow. Maybe they thought it would be funny to leave something by the stone. That had to be it. But the thought didn't hold, because the drawing wasn't just of any dog. The slope of the ears, the dark muzzle, even the line of the back. They were Ranger. Or close enough that Daniel's gut knew it, and no kid in Ironwood could have known about cages. No one except those who had been inside that cabin, who had seen what Daniel had seen. And even then, Daniel exhaled sharply, trying to steady his breath. He crouched again, pressing the paper flat against his knee to study it. The crayon strokes were heavy, the kind a child makes when pressing down with all their strength, trying to force the world to see what they see. The cage bars were jagged, uneven, almost desperate. The letters, too. Crooked, slanted, pressed so hard they nearly tore through the paper. Still alive. The words burned into him. They crawled under his skin, into the empty space where silence had lived for a year. Daniel closed his eyes. For a moment, he let himself imagine it. Ranger alive, somewhere out there, waiting. Scarred, maybe. Changed. But breathing. Not ashes. Not gone. The thought made his chest ache in a way grief never had. Because hope hurts worse than loss. He opened his eyes quickly, as if afraid of what he'd just allowed himself to feel. He stood, slipping the drawing into the inside pocket of his coat, as if hiding it could silence the storm it had stirred. But even with the paper pressed to his chest, he felt the weight of it more than the cold. "Still alive," he whispered again, the words fragile on his tongue. He started walking toward the cemetery gates, boots crunching over the frozen ground. His mind raced with explanations, each one weaker than the last. Maybe the paper had blown in from somewhere else. Maybe it had nothing to do with him. Maybe it was coincidence, but the way the paper had been lodged, half buried in the snow at Ranger's grave, it felt deliberate, and deliberate meant someone had wanted him to find it. The road leading back into town was empty, the world smothered by snow. Daniel walked with his hands buried deep in his pockets, his scarf pulled high against the cold. The drawing weighed heavier than stone against his chest. He tried to summon anger, the kind that would shield him from the dangerous spark inside. Anger at whoever had thought this was a joke. Anger at himself for letting it get to him. But the truth pressed harder than anger could. He wanted to believe it. He wanted it so badly his ribs hurt. At the edge of the cemetery, Daniel stopped and looked back. The rows of stones stretched into the fog, each one a reminder of how final death was supposed to be. But that single scrap of paper whispered something different. A question he hadn't dared to ask since the night of the fire. What if it wasn't the end? The memory surged again, uninvited. The cabin collapsing in flames, the scream of metal and wood, the glimpse of Ranger disappearing into fire, the hopelessness that had followed. But what if the dog had found a way out? What if he had been taken, not killed? The thought clawed at him, refusing to let go. Daniel walked faster, boots slipping on patches of ice, almost as if moving his body could outrun his thoughts. But the drawing was there, in his pocket, pulsing like a second heartbeat. When he reached his truck parked at the roadside, he yanked open the door and slid inside, slamming it shut against the cold. The heater groaned to life, but he hardly noticed. He pulled the drawing out again, holding it in both hands. The shepherd's eyes, drawn in black crayon, stared at him, still alive. Daniel's skepticism fought with something deeper, older. He had been a cop long enough to trust evidence, not ghosts. To believe in facts, not feelings. But facts were what haunted him most. No body had ever been found. No remains, no ashes, nothing. Ranger had gone into the fire, yes. But all they had declared was missing in the line of duty. The stone in the cemetery was a memorial, not a grave. The silence inside him shifted. For the first time in months, it wasn't just absence, it was waiting. His hand tightened on the page. He wanted to tear it up, to scatter the pieces into the snow and pretend it had never existed. But he couldn't. He folded it carefully instead, tucking it back into his pocket, as though it were evidence in a case he hadn't admitted he was working. A case he might not survive opening. Daniel leaned back in the driver's seat, staring through the frosted windshield at the empty road. Snow kept falling, dusting the world in white, hiding everything beneath it. But the paper burned against his chest, refusing to be buried. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "What if you're still out there?" The silence didn't answer. But for the first time, it didn't feel like silence at all. Daniel sat in the cab of his truck, the folded drawing like a live ember in his coat pocket, when movement flickered in the corner of his vision. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, the snow shifting, a shadow bending under the pines. But then it stepped into the open, and his breath caught. A child. She couldn't have been more than 7. Barefoot, in the dead of a Montana winter, her skin pale against the snow. Her hoodie, once red, was frayed and ragged, the fabric clinging to her small frame as though it had weathered 100 storms. The sleeves hung too long, ripped at the cuffs, and her knees were scraped raw above the hem of jeans torn at both shins. She stood on the roadside just beyond the truck's headlights, her hair tangled, dark eyes locked on him. The snowflakes clung to her lashes, but she didn't blink. She just stared, silent and unflinching, like she had been waiting for him. Daniel's first instinct was pure police reflex. Check the area. Look for parents. Scan for danger. No car tracks in the fresh snow. No footprints except hers. She hadn't wandered from a house. She had come from somewhere else entirely. He cracked the door open, boots crunching against the ice. "Hey!" His voice carried too sharply in the cold air. "What are you doing out here? You'll freeze." The girl didn't answer. She walked forward slowly, deliberately, her small feet leaving faint impressions in the snow. Each step looked too careful, like someone who had learned not to draw attention, not to make noise. And then he saw what she held in her hands, a leather collar. His chest tightened. The brown was faded, cracked, the buckle bent and scratched. The brass tag, worn from years of use, swung from the ring, clinking faintly in the wind. Daniel knew it instantly. He would have known it blind. "Ranger," he whispered. His voice broke, the word carried away on the snow. The girl came closer, stopping only when she stood a few feet from him. She held out the collar with both hands. Her fingers were red and raw from the cold, but she gripped it tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "They didn't kill him," she said. Her voice was small but steady, too steady for someone her age. "He's alive. I saw him." Daniel stared, unable to breathe. He reached out, slowly, as if afraid the collar might vanish if he touched it. The leather was ice cold, the edges stiff from frost. He turned it in his hands, his thumb brushing the familiar scratches where Ranger had chewed as a pup during long stakeouts. This wasn't a replica. This wasn't a prank. This was Ranger's collar. He looked back at the girl, his voice low and hoarse. "Where did you get this?" She shook her head, damp strands of hair clinging to her cheeks. "He wore it. They took it off him. But he's still alive." "Who?" Daniel demanded, stepping closer, the words harsher than he meant. "Who took it off him?" For the first time, her expression wavered. Fear flickered across her eyes, but she didn't back away. She glanced over her shoulder at the dark woods behind her, then back at him, as if the trees themselves were listening. "They keep them there," she whispered. "In cages. Dogs. People too. But he—" Her small chin lifted, stubborn. "He's not dead." "I saw him." Daniel felt the world tilt under him. The drawing in his pocket, the collar in his hands. And now this child, appearing from nowhere, barefoot in the snow, speaking the words he had buried for a year. He wanted to demand answers, to press her until she told him everything. But when he looked at her, truly looked, what he saw stopped him. The way her shoulders hunched, always ready to flinch. The darting glance at the trees, the way her bare toes curled in the snow, as if bracing for pain. The tone in her voice, too even, too practiced. This wasn't just a lost child. This was someone who had lived inside fear, and she had come straight to him. Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt tight. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then said, "Mira. Mira." He tried to soften his voice. "You can't be out here like this. It's too cold. You need—" He cut himself off. The collar weighed heavy in his hands. None of this made sense. He looked back at her, desperate now. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure you saw him?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Yes. He's yours, isn't he?" The question hit like a bullet. His mouth opened, but no sound came. He just nodded, once, his vision blurring at the edges. Mira stepped forward, so close now that he could see the grime under her nails, the way her lips trembled from cold, though her voice did not. She looked up at him with a certainty that cut through the snow and silence. "He remembers you," she said simply. Daniel's chest felt like it might crack. Logic screamed at him. This was impossible. It had to be. Ranger was gone, lost to fire. Yet here in his hands was the collar he had buried in memory. And in front of him stood a child who spoke with a conviction no prank could fake. Hope surged again, fierce and painful. "What if?" he whispered. He didn't finish the thought. Couldn't. But it echoed inside him anyway. What if she's right? What if he's alive? The snow swirled harder around them, wind rushing through the trees like a warning. Daniel clutched the collar in one hand and reached for Mira's shoulder with the other, his grip gentle but firm. "Come with me," he said. And for the first time in a year, the silence inside him broke. Not with grief, but with the dangerous, undeniable flicker of belief. The ride back through Ironwood was silent. The truck's heater rattled, blowing warm air into the cab, but Mira sat stiff in the passenger seat, arms tucked tight against her chest, collarbones jutting through the fabric of her ragged hoodie. Her bare feet were tucked up on the seat, pressed together for warmth. She didn't look at Daniel. Her eyes flicked constantly to the side mirror, the windshield, then the back window, like a rabbit that had survived too many hunts. Daniel noticed everything. 38 years old, and the cop in him was trained to read a room, to scan for danger. But tonight, what he saw wasn't a suspect or a threat. It was a child, bone-thin, silent, and carrying a fear that didn't belong to her age. When he turned into his driveway, the garage door groaned open, spilling a square of yellow light into the snow. The house behind it was modest, built of cedar, with a porch buried in drifts. He eased the truck inside, shutting the door against the storm. The garage was colder than the house, but warmer than the woods. Daniel kept it tidy, every tool lined on the pegboard, boxes stacked neatly against the far wall. But what caught Mira's eyes were the old canine training items shoved into one corner. Bite sleeves, a chewed rope toy, a half-collapsed kennel. She looked at them for a second too long, before her gaze darted away again. "Come on," Daniel said gently, shutting off the engine. "Let's get you warm." She didn't move. Her hand hovered over the door handle, frozen as if opening it might trigger a trap. Daniel exhaled slowly, then got out of the truck himself. He walked around, opened her door, and crouched a little so he wasn't towering over her. "It's safe," he said, quieter this time. "You're safe here." Her eyes finally met his, and for the first time he saw the depth of them. Dark, guarded, but carrying something older than 7 years. Slowly she slid out of the seat, the cracked soles of her feet touching the cold concrete floor. She winced, but didn't make a sound. Daniel led her toward the interior door. She followed, light on her feet, but her head kept turning. The garage windows, the corners, the shelves. She scanned everything like she expected someone to burst out at any second. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and pine cleaner. It was lived in but empty, the silence pressing against its walls. Daniel hung his coat, then glanced at Mira, still lingering at the threshold. "You hungry?" he asked. She didn't answer, just lifted her shoulders in a shrug that tried to look casual but failed. Her eyes, though, betrayed her. They flicked to the counter, where a fruit bowl sat with 2 apples, then darted away quickly as if she'd been caught stealing. Daniel softened. He remembered what hunger in a child looked like. His niece back in Billings, when her parents went through their divorce. How she had tried to pretend she wasn't starving when the fridge was empty. Mira had that same look. Without another word, Daniel pulled a plate from the cupboard. He grabbed an apple, sliced it into wedges, then unscrewed the lid of a peanut butter jar. The smell filled the kitchen. Nutty, sweet, familiar. Something simple, something safe. He set the plate on the table, sliding it toward her. "Go on," he said. For a moment she stood frozen, suspicion written in every line of her small body. Then, as if her hunger finally outweighed her caution, she padded forward and picked up a slice. She dipped it into the peanut butter and bit. Her eyes fluttered shut for just an instant. Relief, maybe even pleasure, before they snapped open again, darting back to the window over the sink. Daniel sat across from her, not touching the food himself. He watched the way she ate quickly but carefully, never taking more than 1 slice at a time, never letting her guard down long enough to enjoy it. Between bites, her gaze slid to the door, the hallway, the clock on the wall. She was always scanning. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You do that a lot," he said quietly. Her chewing slowed. "Do what?" "Look around, like you're waiting for someone to come." Mira's hand paused halfway to the plate. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she put the half-eaten slice down carefully, and licked the peanut butter from her fingers, eyes fixed on the tabletop. Daniel didn't press. He knew the look. He'd seen it in victims, in kids pulled out of bad places. You couldn't drag the truth out. You had to wait until they offered it, and you had to earn it. He changed the subject. You know, Ranger loved peanut butter, he said softly. Used to sit by the jar until I gave him some. Made a mess all over the floor. Mira's eyes flicked up then, just for a second. He caught it. A tiny spark of recognition, of something like connection. Then it was gone, hidden under her practice mask. She picked up another slice, smaller this time, and ate it slower. Daniel let the silence stretch. It wasn't the heavy silence of grief this time. It was fragile, like glass, but it was theirs. After a few minutes, Mira wiped her fingers on the sleeve of her hoodie. She looked toward the garage door again, her shoulders stiffening. You don't have to keep checking, Daniel said gently. Yes, I do, she replied. And for the first time, her voice carried something sharper than fear. It carried certainty. Daniel studied her, the collar still heavy in his pocket. Whoever she was, wherever she had come from, she was carrying truths he didn't yet understand. But as he watched her finish the last slice of apple, a child's hunger softening into something like trust, one thought settled deep in his chest. She wasn't just a messenger, she was a survivor. And if she had made it out of wherever she'd been, then maybe, just maybe, Ranger could too. The kitchen was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows, a storm, moving through ironwood in steady waves. Daniel leaned forward on his elbows, hands clasped, watching Mira across the table. She sat, curled into herself, the red hoodie hood pulled halfway over her tangled hair, her knees tucked against the chair. The plate of apple slices was empty now, crumbs of peanut butter smeared faintly on porcelain. But her eyes were somewhere else entirely. Daniel had seen that look before. Soldiers returning from war. Women pulled out of basements. Children who had been made to see things no child should ever have to see. The body sat in the room, but the mind was trapped back where it had bled. He cleared his throat softly. Mira, he said. You said, they took the Ranger. You said you saw him. Who are they? Her head lifted slowly. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze flicking to the window again, then the door, then back to him. She studied him with a kind of suspicion, far too old for a 7-year-old girl. Finally she spoke. Her voice was small but flat, clipped. Men. Daniel frowned. What kind of men? She shook her head, eyes darting away. Big masks, black trucks. Each word fell like a stone. Short, blunt, final. Daniel felt his chest tighten. She wasn't lying. Not with that tone. Not with that stare. They caught you? He asked carefully. Her shoulders hunched. Yes. How? Her fingers fiddled with the frayed edge of her sleeve, pulling at loose threads until they snapped. I was walking. By the road. They stopped. Said they'd take me home. She paused, then added quietly, they didn't. Daniel's throat ached. He wanted to ask 100 questions, but he forced himself to slow down. And then? Mira's jaw worked as though the words were caught in her teeth. When they came in pieces, like broken glass. Cages, she said. Metal. Too small. For dogs. For kids. All together. Cold. Dark. Her eyes flicked up, meeting him for an instant. No windows. The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken. Daniel sat frozen, trying not to let his reaction show on his face. She continued, her voice even but distant, like she was reading a list she'd already memorized. They gave food once a day. Bread, water. Dogs barked all night. Some got sick. Some didn't wake up. Daniel's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He had worked cases of trafficking before. He had seen cruelty, neglect, but to hear it from a child's mouth, spoken so plainly, like it was already carved into her, shook him in ways he hadn't expected. He lowered his voice, gentle. "How did you get out?" Something flickered in Mira's expression then. A small tremor, as if the memory had more weight than the others. She rubbed her hands together, red from cold and cracked skin. "Storm," she said finally. "Big wind. The fence broke. Dogs pushed. Men yelled. Lights went out. I ran." Daniel pictured it. The chaos. The storm tearing through some hidden place in the woods. Dogs slamming against cages, men shouting, children scattering into the dark. And somehow, this small girl had made it out alive. She looked back at him, eyes hard now, steady. "I saw him there," she said. "Your dog. He was in a cage. They shocked him when he didn't listen. But he's strong." Her voice faltered for the first time. "He didn't break." Daniel's breath caught. The collar in his pocket suddenly felt heavier than lead. "You're sure?" he asked. His voice cracked, despite him trying to keep it even. "Mira, are you absolutely sure it was Ranger?" Her face didn't change. Her gaze didn't waver. "Yes." He looked at me. "I knew." Silence fell again, thicker this time, filling the kitchen like smoke. Daniel leaned back slowly, staring at the table, at the smear of peanut butter on the plate. His mind spun. A child was stolen. Hidden cages. Dogs used, broken, discarded. And Ranger, alive, inside that nightmare. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted it so badly it made his chest ache. But he also knew trauma-twisted memories. He knew children could misremember, could fill in blanks with what they needed to see. And yet, she spoke with a certainty no lie could fake. He glanced at her again. She was picking at the wood grain on the table now, her small nails scraping gently over and over. A nervous tick, but her face remained unreadable, too calm, too steady. She had seen too much. No child should speak like this. No child should know cages or men in masks or what it looked like when a dog was shocked for disobedience. And yet she did, which meant she wasn't imagining it. Daniel swallowed hard. He forced his voice steady. "Mira, thank you for telling me." She blinked at him, almost confused, as if she hadn't expected gratitude. Then she pulled her knees tighter to her chest, resting her chin on them. The clock ticked on. The storm raged outside. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had lived with silence for a year, the silence of grief and absence. But now the silence in his kitchen was different. It was heavy with unspoken truth. Mira hadn't just carried scraps of a story. She carried scars, shaped in clipped words, in the way her eyes never stopped scanning, in the hollowness behind her voice. She had seen too much darkness, more than some adults ever would. And if she was right, the Ranger had seen it too. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to think it fully, without flinching away. What if she's telling the truth? What if Ranger is still alive? The thought was terrifying, because if it was true, then this wasn't just grief anymore. It was a fight, and fights could be lost. The storm outside had thickened, snow rattling against the glass like restless fingers. The house was warm now, the hum of the furnace steady, but the air between Daniel and Mira felt fragile, like if he spoke too loud, she might vanish back into the shadows she'd crawled out from. Daniel rose from his chair and crossed to a drawer near the counter. He pulled out an old pad of paper, dog-eared from years of sitting unused, and a box of crayons he'd kept for his niece's visits that never came often enough. He set them gently on the table in front of her. Mira eyed them warily, then looked up at him. "Do you like to draw?" Daniel asked softly. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sometimes." "Good," he said, pulling a chair closer so he sat across from her. He slid the crayons toward her with 2 fingers, careful not to push too hard. "I need you to draw something for me. The place you escaped. Anything you remember. Doesn't have to be perfect." For the first time since she'd stepped into his house, her hands hesitated over something other than the door or the windows. Slowly, she picked up a black crayon, the wax blunt from use, and set the paper flat. Her movements were deliberate, almost mechanical. Thick black lines cut across the page, jagged strokes forming a square. She pressed harder, the crayon tip breaking with a snap. She didn't flinch, she just picked up another and kept going. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He didn't interrupt, he just watched. "This," Mira said, her voice flat, "is the fence. It had knives on top." "Knives?" She nodded, switching to gray, sketching triangles along the top edge. "Sharp, like shark teeth. Dogs cut themselves if they jump." "Razor wire," Daniel realized. Mira drew a cluster of tall shapes behind the fence, crooked but towering. Trees, thick fog all the time. They called it fog camp. Daniel felt something cold crawl down his spine at the name. Fog camp. It sounded like folklore, but the way she said it, it wasn't a story, it was a scar. She switched to brown, dragging the crayon in heavy strokes across the page. Houses, no windows, only doors with locks. Men had keys. She marked X's on the crude rectangles. Dogs here, kids here. Big shed here. The words were too precise for a child's imagination, too specific. Daniel's throat tightened as he watched her. Each line seemed to cost her something, but she kept drawing, as if showing it on paper gave her control over it. Finally, she picked up a red crayon and jabbed it hard into a blank space far from the main cluster, circling it until the paper nearly tore. She drew a rough mound, lines rising and falling like a hill. Then she marked it with a bold X. Her hand froze. She didn't look up when she spoke. "That's where they bury the broken dogs." Daniel's breath caught. The words hung in the air like frost. He stared at the X, the red bleeding into the paper like a wound. "Broken," he echoed quietly. Mira nodded once, still not lifting her eyes. If they don't listen, if they can't carry the things, they put them there. Piles, dirt over them. But sometimes, you still hear them. The crayon slipped from her hand, rolling across the table. As she folded her arms over her chest and turned her face away, the hood of her sweatshirt shadowing her features. Daniel couldn't speak for a long moment. His stomach twisted, and the silence pressed heavy. He'd worked cases of animal cruelty before, but never like this. Never with cages, shock devices, children alongside dogs. He forced himself to steady his breathing. He looked down at the map again. Crude as it was too organized to dismiss. Fence, sheds, fog, a burial ground. This wasn't the rambling of a frightened child. This was testimony. "Mira," Daniel said softly, "are you sure about this place? You're sure it's real?" She finally looked up, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion in her face. "I live there," she whispered. I don't dream lies." The conviction in her voice sent a chill through him. He leaned back, running a hand over his face. His mind spun. If this place existed, if what she was describing was out there in the hills of Montana, then the town had been blind for years. And if Ranger was inside those fences, then he hadn't been lost in fire at all. He had been stolen. Daniel's eyes fell again on the X she had marked in red, where they bury the broken dogs. His stomach turned. Ranger could have been taken there, buried there, or worse. He could still be inside those cages, waiting. He closed the pad gently, sliding it toward him as though it were evidence in an open case, which, in a way, it was. "Thank you, Mira," he said quietly. She shrugged, her shoulders small and sharp under the fabric. Someone had to tell. Daniel studied her, this 7-year-old with words too old for her mouth and a stare that carried more weight than most grown men could bear. She had seen too much darkness, and yet she had chosen to carry a message out of it, the collar in his pocket, the drawing at the grave. Now, this map. Too precise to be coincidence, too real to ignore. And for the first time, Daniel felt something stir in his chest. Not just hope, but resolve. If Fog Camp existed, he would find it. And if Ranger was still alive, he would bring him home. The next morning, Ironwood was wrapped in silence. The storm had passed, but the sky still hung heavy, low with gray clouds. Snow lay thick on the streets, muffling the sounds of the town waking up, plows scraping the roads, the hum of engines, distant voices. Daniel sat alone in the records room of the Ironwood Police Department, a cramped basement space, with walls lined in old steel filing cabinets that smelled faintly of dust and mildew. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, throwing pale light across the cluttered desk where he'd spread stacks of files. He'd been here since dawn, chasing a ghost. The name Mira had whispered, Fog Camp, still rang in his head. She had drawn it with such precision, marked its boundaries with crayons, named it like it was both a prison and a place. And though Daniel had worked Ironwood for nearly 15 years, the name had pulled at something he couldn't quite place. So he dug. The county records were sparse, but buried deep in a stack of property deeds he found it. An old parcel in the northern hills, outside city jurisdiction, 70 acres of rugged forest land, marked as once belonging to Amos Duval. Duval. The name brought back whispers. He'd been a recluse, a figure that haunted the edges of Ironwood folklore. In the late 1970s, Amos had bought up land in the fog-drenched ridge above town. Locals said he built hunting lodges there, stockpiled weapons, ran with men who liked their privacy too much. People told stories of strange lights in the woods, gunshots at odd hours, trucks disappearing into the trees. But Duval himself had vanished in 1984. No trace, no heirs. The land fell into dispute, paperwork shuffled, until no one seemed to know who actually owned it. Over time, the stories of Duval's Ridge turned into campfire tales. Hunters swearing they'd seen movement in the fog, kids daring each other to hike up there and listen for phantom dogs. They called it Fog Camp. Daniel rubbed his temples as he flipped through the brittle papers. What had once been folklore now pressed on him with the weight of something real. Mira's map, the razor wire fence, the sheds, the burial ground. Too many pieces lined up. He pulled another file toward him. This one, an old case report. In 1999, deputies had been called after hikers reported strange animal noises near the ridge. The file noted possible illegal breeding operation, but the case was closed for lack of evidence. In 2007, a similar report. Gunfire in the hills, Smoke spotted through the fog. Again, nothing found. Daniel's fingers drummed on the desk. The pattern was there, hidden in plain sight. Whispers over decades, dismissed because no one wanted to hike into the fog and prove them. He sat back in his chair, exhaling. The light flickered above him, buzzing like a trapped insect. Folklore. That's what everyone had called it. Ghost stories to scare kids away from the ridge. But folklore doesn't leave collars behind. Folklore doesn't draw maps in a child's hand. Folklore doesn't whisper still alive on paper tucked into snow. This was different. This was tangible. Daniel's stomach twisted as he leaned forward again, pulling a topographic map of the county from a drawer. He spread it flat, tracing with his finger the forested hills north of Ironwood, the ridge that always seemed wrapped in cloud, even when the rest of Montana skies ran clear. Fog clung to that place like a secret. And now he had reason to believe it wasn't just weather. It was cover. He imagined cages beneath the trees, dogs pacing behind wire, children crammed into sheds without windows. He thought of Ranger, scarred, alive, trapped in that nightmare. His throat tightened. The door creaked open behind him. Daniel turned, startled. It was Sergeant Clay from patrol, holding a stack of fresh reports. He raised an eyebrow at the sight of Daniel buried in decades-old files. "Morning, Cross. What are you doing down here?" Daniel forced his expression neutral. "Research," Clay chuckled. "On what, ghosts?" He tapped one of the folders with a smirk. "Don't tell me you're chasing the old fog camp stories. My dad used to talk about that place. Bunch of nonsense." Daniel didn't reply right away. He glanced at the crayon map folded in his pocket, the weight of it against his chest. He thought of Mira's hollow voice, of the collar she'd pressed into his hand. "Maybe," Daniel said finally. "Maybe not." Clay shook his head and left, the door closing behind him. Daniel turned back to the files, his jaw set. He no longer saw folklore. He saw breadcrumbs, laid across decades, leading to something Ironwood had chosen not to see. He folded the deed and the map together. Sliding them into a folder, he labeled with 2 words. Fog Camp. The name no longer sounded like legend. It sounded like danger. And somewhere in that danger, if Mira was right, Ranger was waiting. Daniel closed the folder, the decision already made. He was going to the ridge, not as a cop, as a partner who had never stopped listening for his dog's bark in the silence. The captain's office smelled faintly of stale coffee and pine polish. The blinds were half closed against the gray morning light, slats casting stripes across the desk where paperwork lay in neat stacks. Behind it sat Captain Margaret Holloway, shoulders squared, silver threaded through her dark hair, eyes that could strip a man down to his bones. Daniel stood opposite her, a folder clutched under his arm. His coat was still dusted with snow, his boots leaving wet marks on the floor. He hadn't slept, and it showed. The hollows under his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. Holloway didn't speak right away. She let the silence stretch, her gaze sharp and steady, the way she always did when she wanted someone to feel the weight of their choices before she named them. Finally, she said, "You're on leave, Cross. You shouldn't even be in this building." Daniel shifted the folder onto her desk with more force than he meant. "You need to see this." Her eyes flicked down, then back up. "What is it?" "Proof," Daniel said. His voice was rough, almost desperate. "Fog Camp. It's real. Mira's map matches old property records, Amos Duval's land. There are reports going back decades. Hunters, gunfire, animal cries. We ignored them. But it's there." "And Ranger?" His throat tightened. Ranger could be alive. Holloway's jaw worked, but she didn't touch the folder. Daniel, she said, quieter now. I know what this is. This isn't about proof. It's about grief. He bristled. No, this is about the truth. You think I can look at a collar in my hand, a map from a child who lived through hell, and walk away? You think I can leave him out there? Her voice hardened. What I think is you're dragging a 7-year-old into your obsession. Mira is a victim, Daniel. She needs care, safety, and stability, not to be used as a compass for your ghost hunt. The words stung. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced himself to speak levelly. She's not just some victim. She's a witness. She survived what no one else has. If we don't listen to her, more kids, more dogs, whoever's in that place, they'll stay there. Holloway leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. The lines around her eyes deepened. For a moment, her stern mask cracked, and Daniel saw the woman beneath, the widow. Her husband had died in a crash 10 years ago. She never spoke of it, but grief had carved itself into her posture, the way she carried silence like a second skin. I know what it's like, she said softly, to live every day thinking maybe it wasn't the end. Maybe if you just dug hard enough, you'd find the thing you lost. But you can't build your life around what-ifs. Daniel swallowed. This isn't a what-if. This is real. Her gaze sharpened again. Is it? Or are you seeing what you need to see? The question cut deep. He thought of Mira's eyes, the conviction in her voice. The crayon X marked where they bury broken dogs. The weight of Ranger's collar in his pocket. No, this wasn't imagination. You think I'm crazy, Daniel said quietly. I think you're in pain, Holloway replied. And pain makes good cops reckless. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. If it were your husband out there, alive, waiting, would you stop? Would you listen to paperwork and policy and walk away? The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Her lips parted as if to answer, but she didn't. Her eyes flickered with something raw before the wall came back up. Finally, she said, "This isn't about me. It's about you. And right now, you're standing on the line between duty and obsession. I can't let you drag a child across it." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, rough. "I'm not dragging her anywhere. She came to me. She found me. She brought a ranger's collar, Margaret. She's the reason I even know where to look." Holloway exhaled, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Even if everything you're saying is true, this isn't something you can take on alone. And if you go charging into those woods off the word of a traumatized child, you'll end up joining the list of things this department lost." Daniel's chest burned. Every word she spoke had truth in it, but none of it mattered, because behind his eyes, he saw Ranger, not as a memory, but alive, caged, waiting. "I can't walk away," he said finally, his voice like gravel. Holloway looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward, her voice low. "Then you'd better decide what you're doing this as, a cop or a man who can't let go, because those are not the same." The words hung in the room like a verdict. Daniel didn't answer. He just picked up the folder again, clutching it to his chest. He turned toward the door, his shoulders rigid. "Daniel," Holloway called after him. He paused, his back to her. She sighed, and for once her tone softened, almost pleading. "Don't let your grief make you blind. Ranger wouldn't want that. Neither would Mira." Daniel closed his eyes, jaw tight. Then he walked out, leaving the office heavy with silence. Outside, the hall felt colder than the snowstorm waiting beyond the station doors. Duty or obsession? He didn't know which path he was on anymore. All he knew was that he wasn't stopping. The garage was quiet except for the hum of the furnace venting warm air from the house. The snowstorm had eased, leaving the windows fogged with condensation, but the world outside was still buried in white. Daniel stood in the corner, crouched over a heavy metal trunk that hadn't been touched in a year. It was a ranger's box. The paint on the lid was chipped, the padlock rusted from years of damp Montana winters. Daniel turned the key slowly, the click echoing through the space like a gunshot. For a moment, he hesitated. His hand hovered on the latch, breath caught in his throat. Opening it would mean reopening everything he'd locked away. The memories, the silence, the wound that had never healed. He pressed the latch down. The lid creaked open. Inside lay the artifacts of a life lived together, packed away as if waiting for a call that never came. On top was a bite sleeve, the canvas frayed where Ranger's teeth had worn it down during training drills. Daniel picked it up, running his fingers along the deep grooves. He remembered the way Ranger would launch forward on command, jaws locking, shaking with a force that rattled through the fabric straight into Daniel's bones. It had been played to Ranger, work to both of them, trust woven into every grip. Daniel set it aside gently, as though it might break. Beneath it lay a rope toy, chewed until the ends frayed into ragged tassels. He lifted it, and for a second he almost heard the low growl, the tug-of-war battles that had always ended with Ranger dropping the rope into his lap, tail wagging, demanding another round. Daniel's throat tightened. He set the toy down slowly, his hand lingering. Next came the muzzle, black leather straps stiff from disuse. He held it up to the light, remembering the first time Ranger had worn it, how the dog had pawed at it, confused, until Daniel knelt and whispered that it was okay, always okay, as long as they were together. Each item was more than equipment. It was a memory carved into leather, fabric, steel, and every memory reopened the wound. Daniel closed his eyes. His chest ached with the weight of it all, the silence of the past year, the stone in the cemetery, the voice that never barked at his door again. He told himself the box was a coffin, that what was inside was buried along with Ranger. But now, holding these things, he felt something different. Not an ending. A pause. Behind him, the floor creaked softly. Daniel turned. Mira stood in the doorway, her small frame shadowed by the dim light. She was barefoot again, hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. She stepped closer, her eyes falling on the items spread across the floor. For a long moment she didn't say anything. She just studied them, her gaze lingering on the chew toy, the sleeve, the muzzle. Then she looked up at Daniel. "He'll remember," she said quietly. Daniel swallowed, the words hitting harder than she could know. She walked closer, crouching near the box. Her small fingers reached out and brushed the rope toy, barely touching it. "They try to make them forget," she said, her voice even but flat. "They hurt them, shock them, starve them, but they don't forget. Not if someone loved them first." Daniel stared at her, heart pounding. The way she said it, so certain, so calm. It wasn't just a belief. It was knowledge. She had seen it. He picked up the muzzle again, holding it tight in his hands. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You really believe that?" Mira met his gaze without flinching. I know it. Silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of the furnace and the faint whistle of wind outside. Daniel looked down at the gear scattered on the concrete. For months, he'd avoided even glancing at this box. Now, with Mira's words echoing in his ears, it felt less like a coffin and more like a key. Slowly, carefully, he began packing the items into a duffel bag. The bite sleeve, the toy, the muzzle, the harness tucked beneath it all. He added Ranger's old leash, the leather worn soft from years of patrols. Every piece felt like a promise renewed. Mira watched in silence until he zipped the bag closed. Then she asked softly, "When do we go?" Daniel looked at her, startled. "Mira, I'm not staying," she said quickly. "I know the way. I remember the trees, the fence, the fog. You won't find it without me." Her tone was matter-of-fact, too steady for a child. It wasn't bravado, it was survival. Daniel opened his mouth, ready to argue. To tell her she was just a kid, that this wasn't her fight. But the words died, because she had already been in that fight. She had lived it, carried it out in her eyes, in her voice. She knew the path better than anyone. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion heavy. Then he looked back at her, this small, scarred child who had become his only guide. "All right," he said finally, his voice low. "But we do it my way. Careful, quiet, no risks we don't have to take." Mira nodded once. "Okay." Daniel tightened the duffel strap and set it by the door. He glanced once more at the open trunk, at the emptiness inside it now. The silence in the garage felt different. Less like absence, more like anticipation. Ranger's things were no longer relics. They were tools. And if Mira was right, if Ranger remembered, then this wasn't just preparation. It was a reunion waiting to happen. The world outside Ironwood narrowed to white and gray as Daniel steered the truck north. The paved road ended miles back. Now the tires cut through snow-packed trails until even the map gave up. When he finally parked at the forest's edge, silence had already swallowed the world. The ridge loomed like a wall. Pines towered overhead, their crowns lost in a fog so dense it seemed to cling to every branch. It wasn't morning mist. It felt older, heavier, like the ridge itself wanted its secrets hidden. Daniel shouldered the duffel bag, Ranger's old gear pressing against his back, and glanced at Mira. She stood beside him barefoot again, though he'd given her boots and socks. She moved as if she didn't notice the cold. Hood up, hair damp with mist. Her small frame looked sharper against the haze than it had any right to. "This is where it starts," she said quietly. Daniel adjusted his grip on the bag and scanned the tree line. The fog muffled everything. The crunch of snow, the distant call of birds, even the rasp of his own breath. He had hunted these woods, patrolled them, but never felt them like this. Alive, watching. "Stay close," he murmured. Mira didn't answer. She simply stepped forward. The fog swallowed her in seconds, and Daniel followed. Inside, the world shrank to 10 feet of visibility. Beyond that, the mist pressed like a curtain. The snow was softer here, muffled beneath pine needles, every step sinking without sound. Daniel's instincts screamed at the unnatural quiet. Woods were never silent. Even in winter, there was always a crack, a flutter, a rustle. But here, nothing. Only the hollow whisper of fog breathing between trees. Mira moved like she belonged in it. Small steps, careful, her head turning as if listening to voices Daniel couldn't hear. "You sure about this?" he whispered. She nodded once. "I remember." They walked for what felt like an hour, though time blurred. Daniel's boots grew heavier. His lungs burned against the damp chill. He tried to track direction, but everything looked the same. Grey trunks, white ground, veils of mist. Then Mira stopped. She pointed at a fallen stump, jagged and splintered, moss clinging to its side. "Turn here," she said. Daniel frowned. "Why?" "See?" Her finger traced the wood. "Looks like bare teeth." He looked again. The splinters went just upward like crooked fangs. Childlike description, but precise. This wasn't a guess. It was a memory. They turned. The fog thickened, swallowing even sound. Daniel counted steps in his head, grounding himself in rhythm. 30 left, 20 forward. Mira pointed again. Past the tree that bends like a hook. And there it was, an arched pine, unnaturally curved before rising again. He'd missed it until she named it. He tightened his grip on the duffel. No child should know these woods so well, unless she had walked them too many times before. Silence pressed heavier the deeper they went. Once, Daniel thought he saw movement in the mist, something flickering between trees, the faint suggestion of eyes. His hand went to his sidearm, but Mira shook her head and kept walking. "They watch from the trees," she whispered. "Always, don't look back too long." Her words froze him harder than the snow. They wound deeper, the fog twisting landmarks into a labyrinth. His compass app spun uselessly, the arrows sliding in circles. Mira never faltered. At one point she crouched, fingers brushing the ground. Daniel followed her gaze. Half buried in snow lay a rusted beer can, crushed flat. "Hunters," he muttered. Mira shook her head. "Guards. They drink at night." The way she said it, flat, certain, tightened his chest. The forest grew denser. Branches arched overhead like a cage. The air changed too, heavy and damp. Mira stopped again, raising her hand. Through the fog stood a massive boulder, split clean down the middle, the crack yawning like a wound. "Past that," she whispered. "You'll see the fence." Daniel's pulse quickened. He could almost hear Holloway's voice. "You're on leave. Don't drag a child into this." But Mira was already stepping forward, her hood bobbing in the mist. He followed. Every instinct screamed that they were walking past the edge where folklore ended and danger began. The fog thickened further, pressing like wet cloth. Daniel slowed. Something shifted in the air. Less weather, more intention. Mira's hand shot out, gripping his sleeve. She tilted her chin upward. At first he saw nothing. Then his eyes adjusted. A faint, red blink, pulsing like a heartbeat, tucked inside a knot of pine. A camera. The lens was camouflaged beneath bark and moss, wires snaking along the branch and down into frost. The light blinked steadily, unblinking, patient. Daniel's gut clenched. These weren't trail cams. This was tactical, professional. "How many?" he whispered. Mira's face barely moved. "Everywhere." He scanned again, and now he saw them. Another glimmer to the left. A third hidden in birch. Once invisible, they now blinked like a net, tightening around them. Cold sweat slid down his neck. "Christ, this whole place is wired." "That's how they caught me," Mira whispered. Daniel turned sharply. Her eyes stayed fixed on the blink above. "I tried to run," she said. Through the fog. I thought they couldn't see, but they always see. Cameras everywhere. The men wait. Trucks come. Her lips pressed thin. They never miss. The image struck like ice. A barefoot child running through mist, believing she was free, unaware of red eyes in the trees. Radios crackling, men converging, dragging her back. Daniel's jaw clenched. Retreat wasn't an option now. Not with what she'd endured. Not with Ranger possibly still inside. He crouched, voice low. Stay close. Assume they're watching. Mira nodded, too calm for her age. They pressed on. Mira guided with small gestures. Left at the lightning-scarred pine, right past the frozen creek. Daniel's eyes flicked upward constantly. More red pulses. More eyes. Then Mira crouched suddenly, motioning him down. He knelt beside her. Through the fog loomed a pole disguised as a tree. At its top, multiple lenses swiveled slowly, scanning arcs across the woods. A watchtower without guards. Daniel's stomach twisted. This isn't folklore. It's a fortress. Mira leaned close. Don't breathe loud here. It hears. He froze. Every muscle locked. His own heartbeat thundered in his ears. He didn't doubt her. Not for a second. When the lenses finally rotated away, Mira tugged at his sleeve. They crept forward, step by step, deeper into the net. Daniel's mind raced. Cameras meant operators. Operators meant a feed. Somewhere in these woods, men were watching screens, waiting for trespassers. And yet, no one had come, which meant they might already know. The fog shifted. Daniel felt it before he saw it, the air thickening, like breath drawn in. Stay behind me, he murmured. Mira's fingers gripped the back of his coat. His hand brushed his holster. Cold steel steadied him. Then the fog tore open. Shadows surged. 3, 4, maybe more. Distorted by haze but moving with brutal precision. Boots crunched snow. Branches cracked. Daniel drew, but something struck his jaw. Pain burst white. His weapon flew into the snow. He staggered. Vision blurred. Another shadow lunged. He swung hard, fist connecting with bone. An arm? A chest? The figure barely flinched. Behind him, Mira screamed. He spun, dizzy, catching only a glimpse. Her small frame wrenched backward, black-gloved hands pinning her mouth and arms. Her eyes found his for a single heartbeat, wide, terrified, before the mist swallowed her. No! His roar split the fog. Another blow hammered his ribs. Breath tore from his lungs. He staggered, fought, swung again. A heavy strike crashed against his skull. The crack rang like a bell. Daniel dropped to his knees. The world blurred, grey bleeding into black. He clawed at the snow, desperate to crawl toward where Mira had been dragged. "Mira!" he rasped. Her muffled cry answered once. Desperate. Cut short. Hands gripped him, rough, unyielding. He swung weakly, but strength drained out of him. The fog pressed closer, heavy and suffocating. His vision tunneled. The last thing he knew was silence. The silence of the forest. The silence of being taken. Darkness. Time vanished. Daniel floated in and out, weightless. Pain pulsed behind his eyes. The smell came first. Damp mold, rust. Then cold, seeping into his bones. When he forced his eyes open, there was no sky, only concrete above him. The fog was gone, and so was Mira. Daniel woke to darkness. At first, he thought the fog had followed him underground, that same thick white that had swallowed the forest. But this was different. This was heavier, darker. The air was sharp with mildew, heavy with iron, and dampness pressed against his skin like a second layer of clothing. His head throbbed, a dull hammering at the base of his skull where the blow had landed. When he tried to move, pain tore across his shoulders. His wrists burned, rope, tight, coarse, cutting into flesh. His ankles too, bound, forcing him into an awkward half-sitting position against cold concrete. It wasn't foggy. It was a pit. His eyes adjusted slowly. Dim light leaked from a grated opening far above, barely enough to illuminate the walls around him. Concrete, stained dark with age, streaked with mold. Rust streaks bled down from corroded pipes that jutted through the corners. And on the floor, darker stains. Brown, red, old, blood. Daniel's chest tightened. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to push back the panic that wanted to claw its way up his throat. Assess. That's what training taught. Assess, then act. But there was little to assess here. He was underground, tied, disarmed. And Mira was gone. The thought hit harder than the ropes biting into his skin. He had seen her dragged into the fog, her scream torn short. The silence after had been worse than any blow. He tested the ropes again, twisting his wrists until the coarse fibers scraped raw. They held fast, knotted with practiced efficiency. Not amateurs. Daniel leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closing. The despair pressed down as heavy as the concrete above him. The cameras, the shadows, the capture. He had walked willingly into their net, and now Mira was in their hands. A whisper of movement broke the silence. Daniel's eyes snapped open. At first, he thought it was rats, the kind of scratching you expect in places like this. But then he heard it again, clearer. A growl, low, throaty, vibrating through the air like a warning. Daniel froze. His breath caught in his chest. The sound came from above, beyond the grate where the dim light leaked in. Another growl followed, sharper this time. Familiar. His heart stumbled, then raced. "Ranger," he whispered, voice hoarse. The growl stopped. Silence pressed in. Daniel's chest ached as he strained to listen, every nerve alive. Then, another sound, softer, a whine, low, uncertain, but achingly familiar. His throat tightened. It was impossible. It couldn't be. But in that moment, with the whine echoing faintly down the concrete shaft, Daniel knew. It was him, Ranger, alive. Emotion hit like a wave, relief, disbelief, hope so sharp it almost hurt. He pressed forward, straining against the ropes, his voice breaking. "Ranger, it's me. It's Daniel." The growl returned, deeper now, vibrating with recognition. Claws scraped against the grate above, metal screeching under weight. The sound cut through the darkness, through the despair, like a hand reaching down to drag him out of the pit. Tears stung his eyes, unexpected and hot. For a year he had spoken to a stone in a cemetery, whispering into silence. And now, here, in this place of mold and rust and blood, his partner's voice answered. "Good boy," he whispered, choking on the words. "Hold on, I'm here." The whine above grew frantic, claws scratching harder, echoing in the pit like desperate hands digging through earth. Daniel pulled against his ropes again, harder this time, ignoring the sting as skin tore. Pain didn't matter. Nothing mattered but that sound. For the first time since the fire, since the silence, since the grave without a body, he knew Ranger was alive. And no matter what this place was, no matter what men built it or who hunted within its fog, Daniel swore into the darkness of the pit. He was going to get them both out. The sound of the iron door opening above his pit echoed like a death sentence. Harsh light cut down the concrete shaft, blinding after hours of dimness. Boots clanged against the ladder, each step deliberate, measured. When the figure appeared, Daniel knew instantly he wasn't looking at a hired thug. This man carried himself like someone used to command. Broad-shouldered, mid-40s, his black coat stiff with cold. Across his neck, curling down into the collarbone, spread a raven tattoo, its wings stretched, talons open. King, Mira had whispered once in fragments of her story. And now Daniel knew the name wasn't an exaggeration. Gage King Rourke. His presence filled the space before he spoke. Cold eyes, pale blue, cut through Daniel like scalpels. The kind of eyes that didn't see people, just tools, assets, liabilities. Officer Cross, Rourke said evenly, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying authority like a blade hidden in silk. Welcome to Fog Camp. Daniel glared back, jaw clenched, wrists raw against the ropes. Where is she? The girl. Rourke's mouth curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. Alive. For now. She's resourceful, that one. But we'll speak of her later. You're here for another reason. He motioned to the men flanking him, shadows in tactical gear, faces hidden. They hauled Daniel to his feet, ropes still binding his wrists. His body screamed in protest, ribs aching from the ambush. But he stayed upright, forcing his legs to lock. Rourke led the way. Daniel was shoved forward, dragged through a long corridor of reinforced concrete until a set of double doors groaned open. The air changed instantly. Thicker, hotter, heavy with ammonia, sweat, and the musk of animals. Inside stretched a vast barn. Rows upon rows of cages lined both sides, steel bars glinting under fluorescent lights. The sound hit Daniel first. A chorus of low growls, whines, claws scraping metal. German shepherds, dozens of them. They weren't the proud, disciplined canines Daniel knew. These dogs were gaunt, scarred, their fur patchy from neglect. Some bore fresh wounds, others lay curled in corners, their ribs sharp under skin. Their eyes followed him as he passed. Suspicion, pain, hunger. And then Daniel noticed something worse. Packages, taped bundles, small enough to swallow, lined in crates stacked near the cages. Drugs. He knew instantly. This was trafficking. The dogs weren't partners here. They were couriers, mules, trained to carry poison inside their bodies. Daniel's stomach twisted. He wanted to lunge, to tear the locks off every cage, to set them free. But the grip of the guards on his arms held firm. Rourke walked ahead, his voice calm, almost conversational. Smart animals, aren't they? Loyal by nature. Easy to train, easier to break. People underestimate just how much pain they can carry before they break. He stopped near one cage and crouched, sliding 2 fingers along the bars. The shepherd inside snapped with a snarl, teeth bared, but the shock collar around its neck flashed red. The animal yelped, collapsing in on itself. Rourke's face remained unreadable. Obedience, he said softly. That's what matters. Not love, not loyalty. Obedience. Daniel's jaw locked so hard his teeth ached. He spat the words like venom. You're sick. Rourke rose, brushing dust from his gloves. No, I'm a realist. The world doesn't run on sentiment, officer. It runs on power. And here, power belongs to those who command. He turned, motioning forward again. Daniel was shoved along the row, every cage a mirror of suffering, until Rourke stopped at one near the end. He didn't speak. He only tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly as if to study Daniel's reaction. Daniel's heart slammed. Inside the cage lay a German shepherd, larger than the rest. His coat was darker now, streaked with soot, his body scarred with lines across his flank and shoulder. One ear bent slightly from an old wound. His ribs showed, but the power in his frame was still there, coiled and waiting. The dog lifted his head slowly, eyes meeting Daniel's. Brown, deep, familiar. The breath left Daniel's chest. His knees nearly buckled. Ranger, he whispered. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound. His gaze sharpened, recognition flickering like a spark in the gloom. He stood, muscles taut, scars shifting across his frame. His tail didn't wag, but his body trembled, caught between conditioning and memory. Daniel pressed forward against the guard's grip. It's me, boy. It's me. Rourke watched with interest, arms folded. Ah, so it's true. I wondered if he'd still recognize you. Fascinating. Daniel's voice cracked. Let him out. Now. Rourke chuckled softly, the sound devoid of warmth. Oh, I will. But not for you. For me. For the work he's meant to do. He nodded toward the handlers at the far end. Show him. One of the men entered the cage with a padded dummy target. The shepherd's body snapped into motion at the handler's command, teeth bared, muscles surging. He lunged, clamping down on the sleeve with brutal precision. He shook, tore, executed the drill flawlessly. But when the dummy fell, the shepherd's head lifted again. His eyes found Daniel, and this time, the spark was brighter. Recognition. Daniel's throat closed. Tears burned hot behind his eyes. Good boy, he whispered, voice breaking. You remember. Rourke tilted his head, the raven tattoo shifting as he smirked. Interesting, he murmured. The slate isn't as clean as I thought. The shepherd growled low, not at the dummy, not at the handler, but at Rourke. Daniel saw it. He felt it. Ranger wasn't gone. He wasn't broken. Not yet. And that meant there was still a chance. The barn reeked of sweat, ammonia, and something worse. Fear soaked into concrete, into steel, into fur. The hum of the overhead fluorescents buzzed like angry insects, cutting down in harsh light. Daniel stood between two guards, wrists still bound, chest tight, as he watched the cage at the far end. Ranger, his partner, his shadow, his missing half. The shepherd stood rigid, dark coat streaked with scars, muscles twitching with conditioned tension. His eyes, though dulled by months of brutality, still burned with something Daniel recognized. Memory. A spark buried under layers of pain. The handler, a thin, twitchy man with darting eyes, clipped a leash to Ranger's collar and yanked him into the open. Target, he barked, pointing at a padded dummy across the floor. Ranger launched forward instantly. The dog's body moved like a weapon. Powerful, flawless, every ounce of training buried deep in his bones. He hit the dummy with brutal force, teeth sinking into the padded arm, ripping, shaking, tearing, until the fabric split. The room filled with the sound of snarls and snapping jaws, echoing like gunfire in the steel barn. The handler's face twisted into a cruel grin. "Good dog. Again." Ranger obeyed without hesitation. He circled back, eyes sharp, body tense, then lunged once more, crushing the target with the same lethal precision. Daniel's stomach turned. He'd seen Ranger perform these drills 100 times in the academy, in the field, always with pride, always rewarded with a laugh, a pat, a word of love. But here the movements felt hollow, conditioned, programmed. Not a partnership, but slavery. "Stop!" Daniel shouted hoarsely, straining against the guard's grip. His wrists tore raw against the ropes. "You don't treat him like that. He's not your tool. He's mine." The words hung in the air like a shot. Ranger froze. The dummy dangled from his jaws, shredded fabric hanging limp. Slowly, his head lifted. His body trembled with confusion, conflict. And then his eyes found Daniel. For a second, the world stilled. Brown eyes, scarred, weary but alive, locked with his. Recognition flickered there, faint but unmistakable, like a flame struggling against wind. "Ranger," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "It's me. Partner, it's me." The shepherd's ears twitched, his jaws slackened, the dummy slipped from his teeth. The handler snarled, yanking hard on the leash. "No! Attack, damn it! Attack!" Ranger didn't move. His body shuddered, torn between command and memory. His eyes stayed fixed on Daniel, the spark growing brighter, stronger. Daniel's heart pounded so hard it hurt. "That's it, boy," he whispered, straining forward. "Remember, you remember me." Rourke stepped closer, his cold blue eyes narrowing with curiosity. The raven tattoo shifted across his neck as he tilted his head. "Well," he murmured, "that's interesting." He folded his arms, studying the scene like a scientist observing a specimen. The slate isn't clean, after all. The handler yanked the leash again, panic creeping into his voice. "He's resisting." "The conditioning—" "Silence," Rourke snapped, his voice cutting sharp. He never looked at the handler. His gaze stayed locked on Ranger. The shepherd's growl filled the air, low and guttural. His body angled slightly, no longer toward the dummy, but toward the guards restraining Daniel. Rourke's lips curved into the faintest smile. Fascinating. Daniel's chest heaved with hope so fierce it almost broke him. For the first time in a year, he saw not just a shadow of his partner, but Ranger himself, scarred, changed, but not gone. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, tears burning hot. "You didn't forget. Not once." The guards tightened their grip, the handler trembling with the leash. Ranger's body coiled, muscles taut, growl deepening as though he was ready to lunge, not at the dummy, but at anyone who touched Daniel. Rourke stepped closer, voice calm, almost amused. "You've survived fire, Officer Cross. You've survived grief. But this," he gestured toward Ranger with one gloved hand, "this is survival at its purest. Loyalty tested, conditioned, broken and rebuilt, yet still." He smiled faintly. "Threads of memory remain." Daniel's eyes never left Ranger's. "You can try to break him all you want," he said, voice raw but steady. "But you'll never erase me." Ranger snarled louder, tugging against the leash, teeth bared, not at Daniel, but at the man holding him back. The handler stumbled, fear flashing in his eyes. "He's not listening." Rourke's voice cut sharp. "Then make him listen, or I'll find someone who can." But Daniel saw it. The hesitation. The flicker of defiance in Ranger's eyes. The bond forged through years of work, of trust, of love, stronger than cages and shock collars. For the first time, Daniel knew with certainty, Ranger wasn't gone. And if there was even the smallest spark left to fan into flame, he would fight to bring it roaring back. The barn lights buzzed, casting a harsh white over concrete stained with dirt and blood. Daniel stood bound between two guards, wrists raw, chest tight. Across the floor, Ranger panted, trembling, torn between conditioning and memory. Trent, the twitchy handler, stepped forward. His thin frame jittered as he clutched a black remote, the red button glowing beneath the fluorescent light. Daniel's stomach dropped, the shock collar. Rourke stood nearby, arms folded and gaze cold. "Proceed." Trent's lips moved in nervous mutters. "Yes, sir." He pressed the button. The jolt ripped through Ranger. The shepherd convulsed, claws scraping concrete, a strangled yelp tearing the air. Foam flecked his jaws as his body thrashed. "Stop!" Daniel bellowed, lunging, but the guards pinned him back. His shoulders burned with resistance. "God damn it, stop!" "Again," Rourke said, voice flat. Trent obeyed. Ranger's body jerked harder, confusion flooding his wild eyes. Daniel's voice cut through. "Sit." The command cracked like a whip. Ranger froze mid-spasm, ears twitching, gaze searching. "Sit, Ranger! Sit!" Daniel barked again, throat raw. The shepherd quivered, weight shifting back, haunches trembling. Not a clean sit, but not collapsed either. It was defiance. It was a memory. Trent cursed, stabbing the button. Ranger crumpled sideways, scraping the floor. "Down!" Daniel roared. His voice split the hum of lights, the handler's panic, the dog's cries. "Down, Ranger!" The shepherd's head jerked toward him. Through agony, through shocks, Ranger's legs folded beneath him, trembling, imperfect, but obedience all the same. Trent paled. "What the? He's not supposed to—" "Quiet!" Rourke snapped, silencing him with a glance. The raven tattoo on his neck stretched as he tilted his head, eyes narrowing with intrigue. Interesting. Ranger lay panting, chest heaving, but his eyes never left Daniel. Daniel steadied his voice, softer now. "Good boy. Down. Stay." The shepherd whimpered, ears flicking, body trembling, but he clung to the voice that had always been his anchor. Trent's panic spilled over. "Sir, this isn't right. He's supposed to obey us, not—" Rourke silenced him again. "Even pain can't sever every bond. Conditioning bends the body, but the mind—" His gaze lingered on Ranger. "The mind remembers." Daniel met his eyes. "He's not yours. He'll never be yours." Rourke's smile was faint, chilling. "We'll see." He gestured, and the remote light dimmed as Trent let go. Silence followed, louder than the shocks. Daniel's wrists bled against the ropes, chest heaving, but something inside him shifted. He had proof now. Ranger remembered. The shed nearby was little more than a rotting box, sagging under damp years. A single bulb swung overhead, sputtering more shadow than glow. Mira sat curled in the corner, hoodie pulled tight. Her toes pressed into the cold dirt floor, but her eyes weren't wide with fear anymore. They were sharp, alive. She had lived in worse cages. Through cracks in the wood, thin slices of light cut across the floor. Voices bled through faintly. The handlers barked orders, dogs' yelps, the buzz of fluorescent lights. She had been here before, but this time, Daniel was here. And so was Ranger. She had seen it. Ranger's gaze locking on Daniel, the voice breaking through the cruelty. She knew what she saw. Ranger remembered. Resolve burned in her chest. She scanned the shed. Rusted nails jutted from the walls. A splintered shard of wood had broken loose from the floor. She picked it up, point sharp enough to scratch. Kneeling, she dragged it across the boards. The first squeal made her flinch, but she pressed harder, forcing letters into the grain. Her hands shook, splinters digging under her nails. But she didn't stop. K-N-O-W-S. Her breath fogged the bulb's dim light. She angled the words toward the crack in the wall. If Ranger passed by, if his eyes searched like they always did, he might see Y-O-U. She sat back, wiping her hands on her hoodie. The message glared up at her, uneven but clear. He knows you. Her chest rose and fell fast. She pressed her face to the crack, whispering into the dark. He remembers you. Exhaustion tugged at her small frame, but she lay beside her carved words as if guarding them. Because Mira knew what cages tried to do, erase you piece by piece. But she also knew memory, born of trust and love, was stronger than pain. She whispered once more, softer, as if the words themselves could reach Daniel and Ranger. Don't forget. He's still yours. The bulb sputtered. She closed her eyes, not afraid anymore. The barn reeked of iron and fear. Cages rattled with restless dogs, their low growls building like distant thunder. Daniel stood bound, wrists raw, eyes fixed on Ranger. The shepherd was dragged out again, trembling with exhaustion, but gaze alive, locked on Daniel like a compass straining for true north. Trent sneered, remote clutched in his hand. Attack, now! The leash snapped taut. Ranger surged forward, teeth bared, a growl ripping the air. For one gut-wrenching instant, Daniel braced for his partner's jaws. But Ranger stopped. His body slid sideways, planting himself between Daniel and Trent. Hackles raised, tail stiff, growl aimed not at Daniel, but at the handler behind him. Trent froze. What the? Ranger's stance was unmistakable. Guarding, shielding. Daniel's breath caught. Good boy, he whispered, voice breaking. You remember? Trent's face twisted. He slammed the button. The collar crackled. Ranger convulsed, claws screeching on concrete. But his paws stayed planted, body shielding Daniel. Obey! Trent shrieked. Obey, damn you! The shocks tore through him. But Ranger stayed put, trembling, snarling through agony. Ranger, look at me! Daniel's voice cut through. Ranger, down! Through the pain, Ranger's eyes locked on his. Memory flared. Down! Daniel commanded again. The shepherd dropped, pressing himself low to the floor, still between Daniel and Trent, growling even as his body spasmed. The remote slipped from Trent's fingers, clattering on concrete. His face went pale. No. He's supposed to be clean. He's supposed to be ours. He stumbled backward, panic unraveling. Stupid dog! He shoved past the other handlers, bolting into the night. Silence fell. Only Ranger's ragged panting filled the barn. Daniel strained against the guards, his voice low, steady, meant for one set of ears. You're still mine, he whispered. Ranger whined, trembling, nudging his scarred muzzle against Daniel's bound hands. The touch was hesitant, reverent, testing if the bond was still real. Daniel's eyes burned. His fingers pressed into the rough fur, patchy with scars, and in that fragile contact, the past crashed into the present. Ranger hadn't forgotten, not the fire, Not the bond, not him. The shed was silent except for the faint buzz of the flickering bulb overhead. Mira sat on the dirt floor, knees drawn tight, hoodie damp against her shoulders. She hadn't closed her eyes once. Sleep was a luxury she had long ago learned to live without. Instead, she listened. Every sound mattered. The crunch of boots, the distant bark of dogs, the hum of generators buried in fog. Captivity had its own language, and at 7 years old, Mira already spoke it. Her fingers brushed the floor where she had carved earlier. He knows you. The grooves steadied her. Ranger would see it. Ranger would remember. Now it was her turn. From the hem of her hoodie she drew the bent wire she had hidden, along with the rusted nail she'd pried loose. Crude tools, but enough. She crept to the door. The padlock hung heavy and corroded, more relic than steel. She studied it the way she once studied the faces of the men with keys, patiently, searching for weakness. The wire scraped inside the keyhole, too thick at first. She pressed harder, angled the nail, listened for the faint clicks. Her breath was shallow, every sound inside the lock booming like thunder. Footsteps crunched outside. Mira froze, heart hammering. A guard muttered something low, then drifted away. She pressed on, wire twisting, nail pressing. Sweat dampened her palms. Then, click, another. One more turn, and the shackle snapped free. She caught it before it hit the ground, easing it into the dirt. Cold air bled in as she cracked the door. Fog rolled over her face, biting her skin. Barefoot, she slipped outside. The frost cut her toes, but she didn't flinch. The camp stretched in shadow and light. Floodlights buzzed in arcs, cutting the fog with white beams. Between them, darkness pooled like a living thing. Diesel fumes mixed with wet pine and the sour tang of blood. Mira crouched low, slipping from shadow to shadow. Barrels, a broken cart, the hollow shell of a truck. Guards passed with rifles slung, muttering about the cold. She pressed herself flat, breath trapped in her chest until their voices faded. From her cover she saw it. The barn. Its wide doors glared with harsh light, spilling the echo of barking dogs and harsh orders. She crept closer, belly to the frost. A spotlight swept across, and she went still, face pressed into the soil, body shaking from the cold, but never moving. At the barn wall she crouched, listening. Men shouting. A dog's growl. Daniel's voice, sharp with command. She tightened her grip on the shard of wire. She had broken one lock. She could break another. The barn's air hit her like a wave of iron and fear. Rows of cages rattled with restless German shepherds. Some paced endlessly, eyes dull. Others curled tight, ribs sharp beneath fur, broken down into obedience. Mira slipped through the shadows, ducking behind crates. The handlers at the far end argued loudly, distracted. She scanned the cages until she found him. Ranger. He stood rigid in a larger pen, scars cutting across his flank, coat patchy, but strength unmistakable. His ears flicked at each sound, body tense, alive with readiness. Her breath caught. Even scarred, even broken, she knew him. The dog who had stood once in fire and refused to forget. She crept to the keypad. From her pocket, she pulled the napkin she had stolen. Numbers scrawled across its greasy surface. She'd watched a handler punch them in before. She keyed them carefully. Red turned green. The lock clicked. The sound was quiet, but it roared in her chest. She eased the latch and opened the door. Ranger didn't move. He stared at her, stiff, muscles locked, a low rumble vibrating his chest. Mira crouched low, voice steady. "It's okay. Daniel's here. He remembers. So do you." His ears twitched at the name. Suspicion flickered, then something else. Memory. She held out her hand, palm open. Waited. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then Ranger limped forward, dragging his back leg, trembling but determined. His nose brushed her hand. Mira stroked his muzzle, feeling the scars beneath her fingers. His body shook, not with fear, but release. "You're free now," she whispered. "Come with me." Ranger stepped from the cage. He could have bolted into the dark, but instead pressed against her side, eyes never leaving hers. He had chosen. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back. No time. She wrapped her arm around his neck. "Quiet now. We have to go." They moved together along the wall, child and scarred shepherd, shadow to shadow. Every cage they passed erupted in snarls and claws. Mira whispered urgently, "Shh, not now. Quiet." At the far door, she froze. Laughter carried across the barn, cruel and careless. A spotlight swept above. Ranger growled low, but Mira laid a hand on his neck. "Not yet. Wait." The voices faded. The light swung away. She pushed forward again, her bare feet burning from cold. Ranger's limp, steady beside her. Survivors, moving as one. The pit stank of rust and damp. Daniel slumped against the concrete, wrists raw, body heavy with exhaustion. The silence pressed close, broken only by a drip of water somewhere above. Then, claws scraping. He lifted his head, dazed. At first he thought it was memory, another cruel echo of Ranger in his skull. But the sound grew sharper, real. Another sound followed. Small, bare feet pattering above. A voice, high, urgent. "Daniel, I'm here!" His body jolted with relief. "Mira, get back. It isn't safe." "No!" She cut him off, fierce. "I'm not leaving you. I found Ranger. He's with me." Daniel froze. His heart slammed. For a moment he thought he'd misheard. But then came the growl, low, alive, real. "Ranger." Daniel's throat burned. "Good boy," he whispered. "You really came back." Above, Mira fumbled against something metallic. The control panel. Sparks hissed. Then with a groan the great lock clanged loose. She shoved, grunting, but the grate barely budged. "It's stuck!" "Rusted bolts," Daniel rasped. "You'll need help." A heavier scrape followed. Ranger, his muzzle pressed to the grate, teeth tearing at rust, claws raking at bolts until metal squealed. His body shook with effort, but he didn't stop. "Good boy," Daniel called. "That's it, Ranger. Pull." Mira jammed the wire into the bolts, straining with all her strength. Together, girl and dog worked in a frantic rhythm, metal groaning, bolts snapping loose one by one. Finally, the grate shrieked open. Cold air rushed down. Mira's face appeared, pale and dirt-smudged, eyes burning with resolve. Beside her, Ranger shoved his head forward, ears pricked, eyes locked on Daniel. The sight broke him. Tears blurred his vision. "Good boy," he whispered again. "You came back." "Grab on," Mira cried, extending her hand. Daniel staggered upright, muscles screaming. He caught her small hand. Ranger braced against the grate, teeth clamping his sleeve, hauling. Inch by inch, they pulled him free. With a final heave, Daniel rolled onto the floor above, gasping in the cold air. Mira flung her arms around his neck. "I told you I'd find you," she whispered, trembling. He held her close, brushing tangled hair from her face. "You're braver than anyone I've ever known." A soft nudge pressed his other hand. Daniel turned, and there he was. Ranger, scarred, limping, but alive. The shepherd whined, pushing his muzzle into Daniel's palm. Daniel's voice broke. "You're still mine. Always." Ranger licked his hand, tail thumping weakly. His body leaned into the touch, trembling not from fear, but relief. For a moment they stayed there, cop, child, dog, breathing together in the dim barn. For the first time since the fire, Daniel felt whole, but boots thudded in the distance. Voices barked orders. The guards had heard. Daniel pulled Mira close, one arm steadying Ranger's shaking frame. His eyes sharpened, steel returning to his voice. "We're not done yet," he said. "But we're not running alone anymore." Ranger growled low, teeth flashing. Mira clutched Daniel's sleeve tight. Together, they turned toward the shadows of the barn, not captives. Survivors. The silence shattered. A metallic wail split the camp, shrill, unrelenting, bouncing off the barn walls and bleeding into the fog. Red strobes flared overhead, painting the concrete in violent pulses. The alarm. Daniel's chest seized. Boots thundered across the yard, voices sharp and clipped. Mira clung to his arm, fingers digging into his sleeve. Her eyes were wide, but her voice steady. "They know." Daniel pulled her close with one hand and gripped Ranger's scruff with the other. The shepherd trembled from exhaustion, his back leg dragging, but his ears stood sharp. A growl rumbled deep in his chest. Even scarred, even limping, Ranger was ready. The barn doors slammed open. Floodlights cut through haze, sweeping the cages and floor. Silhouettes filled the doorway, rifles, helmets, boots. "Move," a voice barked. "Block the exits." Daniel's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them. Mira was too small, Ranger too injured. He needed something else, something the guards wouldn't expect. A memory sparked. The academy. Old K9 drills, half forgotten. Not everyone knew it, but handlers once used bark and howl codes, patterns that carried through woods like Morse. Primitive, maybe, but effective. Clara. He'd drilled it into her years ago, back when she was a rookie. She'd laughed at the absurdity, but she'd remembered. And if she was anywhere close, she might hear. And Daniel dropped to one knee beside Ranger, gripping his muzzle. "One last job, partner," he whispered. "Sing for me." Ranger's eyes locked on his ears, twitching. Daniel tilted his head back and howled, short, long, short. Ranger joined him. The sound was raw but strong, slicing through the alarm's wail. Together, man and dog carved a message into the night. Short, short, long, long, short. SOS. The guards froze for a split second, startled by the sound. Then rifles snapped upward. "Shut them up!" Gunfire cracked. Bullets sparked against cages. Dogs howled in terror. Steel rattled like thunder. Mira dropped flat, hands over her ears, her small body pressed to the floor. Daniel dragged her behind an overturned trough. Ranger pressed close, growling through the din. Shrapnel bit into his shoulder, but he ignored it. "Howl, Ranger! Again!" The shepherd obeyed. His voice rose hoarse but defiant, cutting above the chaos. Each note a beacon hurled into the fog. And then, from somewhere far off, an answering howl. Daniel's chest seized. Clara. It had to be. Guards shouted louder now, panic in their voices. They're signaling. Shut them down. Daniel bent low, lips brushing Mira's tangled hair. They heard us, he whispered. Hold on. Just hold on. The command trailer rocked in the wind. Inside, screens glowed and radios crackled. Fog smothered the ridge outside, a wall of grey that swallowed headlights whole. Officer Clara Moreno stood rigid at the console, headset pressed tight. A red dot blinked on her screen, the GPS tracker she had planted in Daniel's truck weeks ago, buried under the excuse of routine procedure. She had known better. Daniel Cross was her mentor, her anchor. Ranger's disappearance had gutted him, but she knew he wouldn't stop. And now the tracker pulsed inside Fog Ridge. Her stomach was already tight when she heard it. At first, static bleeding through comms, then clearer. A howl. Long. Short. Short. She froze, listening. The pattern came again, crude, jagged, but unmistakable. Morse. Her breath caught. Daniel's voice echoed from years ago. Anything that carries sound can carry a message, even a howl. He'd made her laugh, barking SOS across the canine yard. But she had remembered. Now here it was. Clara's voice snapped across the trailer. That's him. That's Cross. The room froze. Techs lifted their heads. SWAT officers paused mid-gear check. Urgency rippled like current. Confirm? The commander barked. Clara didn't hesitate. Confirmed. SOS. He's alive. The commander turned to the map. Location? She stabbed a finger at the screen. Fog Ridge. He's not alone. He wouldn't risk this, unless he had Ranger. And the girl. Silence lingered. Everyone knew Fog Ridge. Rumors, failed raids, bodies never found. But Daniel's signal cut through it all. The commander's jaw set. Mobilize. Breach plan Beta. The trailer erupted. Armor strapped on, rifles locked, radios buzzing with call signs. Clara shoved her headset aside and grabbed her vest. The commander caught her arm. Moreno, your comms. We don't need loose ends. She tore free, her voice steel. He trained me. He trusted me when no one else did. You think I'm sitting here while he signals from hell? I'm going in. The commander studied her, then nodded once. Alpha point. Don't make me regret it. Clara pulled her vest tight, fingers steady despite the storm in her chest. She climbed into the lead vehicle as engines roared. Fog swallowed the convoy whole. On the dash, the red dot pulsed. Daniel was alive, and tonight she would bring him home. The ridge exploded with noise. Shouts tore through the fog, boots hammering frozen ground. Floodlights swept arcs across trees, searching, hunting. Daniel shoved Mira forward. Run! Don't stop! Her breath burst in white clouds as her bare feet skidded against frost. Ranger limped beside her, dragging his leg but never falling behind. Gunfire cracked. Bullets shredded bark, splinters stinging Mira's face. She stumbled. Daniel yanked her upright. Keep moving. The forest thinned into a ravine. Rocks jutted sharp, slick with ice. Mira's foot slipped. She tumbled down the slope, a scream tearing from her throat. Mira! Daniel lunged after her. But Ranger moved first. He hurled himself down the incline, claws tearing into ice. His body slammed against hers, teeth catching her sleeve just before she slid into the black water below. Growling with effort, he dragged her back. Mira clung to his neck, sobbing, "I've got you," though it was Ranger who held her. Daniel scrambled down, grabbing her hand, hauling her up. Together they steadied against the ridge. Ranger braced until both were safe, his body quaking with strain. Daniel's hand ruffled his scarred fur, voice breaking. Good boy, still saving lives. But there was no time. Flashlights sliced the fog above, rifles clattered. Guards were closing in. Daniel searched the trees desperately. And then, a new sound. The chop of rotor blades. He looked up. A helicopter burst through the fog, searchlight blazing. The beam locked on them, 3 figures clinging to the ridge. Mira shielded her eyes. Ranger barked once, loud and defiant. The guards panicked, firing wildly. The helicopter banked hard, spotlight fixed on Daniel and Mira as the side door slid open. Black-clad figures leaned out, rifles steady. Clara's voice cut through a loudspeaker. "Ironwood PD! Hands down! Don't move!" Chaos erupted. Guards scattered, some firing back, others ducking into trees. Muzzle flashes lit the fog in bursts of fire. Daniel shielded Mira, crouched low as Ranger pressed against them. Snow whipped in the downdraft, burning his skin. But help was here. From the tree line, SWAT surged, fast, precise, rifles up. Voices crisp. "Alpha, left flank." "Bravo secure." Gunfire rattled, guards fell. The ridge turned to chaos, but the spotlight never left Daniel, Mira, and Ranger. "Daniel!" Clara's voice pierced the roar. She stood in the helicopter door, harness strapped, eyes locked on him. "Hold them there!" she shouted. "We've got them!" A rope dropped, whipping in the wind. 2 SWAT officers rappelled down, hitting the ground hard. One grabbed Mira, securing her in a harness. The other reached for Daniel. Ranger bristled at their sudden touch, growling, but Daniel pressed a hand to his muzzle. "Easy, boy. They're here for us." The officer clipped Mira first. She clung to Ranger, screaming, "Don't leave him." Daniel's voice cut sharp. "He comes with us, no matter what." The officer hesitated, then nodded. They looped a harness around Ranger's chest. The dog trembled, but didn't resist. His eyes never left Daniel. Gunfire still cracked, but SWAT pressed forward, pushing the guards back. "Go!" Clara shouted. "Lift them out!" The line jerked upward. Daniel, Mira, and Ranger rose into the storm of snow and light. The ground fell away, chaos shrinking to a blur of fog and muzzle flashes. Mira buried her face in Ranger's neck. The shepherd pressed against her, shielding her. Daniel wrapped an arm around both, clutching the rope until his knuckles bled. The helicopter climbed, spotlight blazing like a sun. And through the roar, Daniel whispered into Ranger's ear, voice breaking with relief. "You're going home." Dawn crept over Ironwood in muted grey, the kind of light that softened snowbanks, but never reached the marrow. Inside the veterinary hospital, machines hummed steadily, the air sharp with antiseptic. Daniel sat hunched in a straight-back chair, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the figure stretched across the bed. Ranger. The shepherd lay swathed in bandages, IV lines taped to his foreleg. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, every breath a fragile reassurance. Patches of fur were shaved where wounds had been cleaned and stitched. Scars, old and new, traced maps across his body. But he was here. Alive. Daniel leaned forward, his hand brushing lightly across Ranger's paw. The rough pads twitched under his touch. "Good boy," he whispered, voice breaking. You're safe now. We made it out. For hours he had spoken like this. Memories, promises, commands murmured into the quiet. And though Ranger never lifted his head, his ears flicked at the sound of Daniel's voice. Each twitch was proof the bond still held. The door opened softly. Dr. Evelyn Shaw stepped in. Her coat creased from long hours, dark hair pulled into a knot. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had seen the worst and carried it anyway. She checked the monitors, then looked at Daniel. "He's stable," she said gently. "Malnourished, dehydrated, badly wounded, but none of it fatal. He's a fighter. He'll pull through." Daniel exhaled, shoulders sagging though his hand never left Ranger's paw. His voice cracked. They tried to break him, to make him forget. But when it mattered, he remembered. Dr. Shaw's expression softened. "That's because memory doesn't just live in muscle or training. It lives in imprint." Daniel frowned. "Imprint?" She nodded. "With working dogs, the first bond with a handler goes deeper than habit. Your scent, your voice, the rhythm of how you move. It marks them. Even if someone tries to rewire everything else, that bond remains, waiting." Her words struck deep. Daniel stared at Ranger, bandaged and broken, but alive, and understood. Patrol nights, bite sleeves, long shifts in squad cars, all of it had carved a connection no shock collar could erase. He bent his head, forehead pressed gently to Ranger's paw, tears slipping free. "You never left me, even when I thought you were gone." The shepherd's ear twitched, faint but sure. "Doctor." Shaw smiled. "See, he knows your voice. That never left." Light spilled pale through the frosted windows, catching on Ranger's bandages until they seemed almost luminous. For the first time since the fire, Daniel believed dawn could mean more than survival. It could mean return. The courthouse cafeteria was nearly empty, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, snow muffling the streets outside. Mira sat at a long table, legs dangling above the floor, swallowed in an oversized hoodie. Steam curled from the mug of cocoa cupped in her hands. Beside her lay Atlas, Clara Moreno's sable German shepherd. At first, Mira had stiffened when Clara brought the dog in, but Atlas had simply lain at her side, head on his paws, ears flicking gently. Now, only an hour later, Mira's fingers combed slowly through his thick fur. Atlas sighed and leaned into her touch. Across the room, Clara watched quietly. Daniel sat nearby, still in his rumpled shirt from the hospital. His face was drawn, but softened as he watched Mira. "She's good with him," Clara murmured. Daniel nodded. "She's good with all of them. Even after everything, she still reaches out." Before Clara could answer, a clerk entered with a folder in hand. He crossed to Daniel. "The judge has signed the order," he said. Daniel stood, bracing himself. "And?" "The court has granted you emergency guardianship of Mira, effective immediately. The review hearing is in 30 days, but until then, she's yours to care for." Daniel exhaled slowly. Guardianship. The word settled heavy, but not like grief. This weight was different. A responsibility, yes, but also a lifeline. He glanced at Mira, still bent over Atlas, her fingers buried in the shepherd's ruff, as if she belonged there. The clerk set the papers down and left. Daniel sat again, staring at the documents but hardly seeing them. Mira looked up. Her voice was small but steady. "What does that mean?" Daniel slid the papers closer, choosing his words carefully. It means you don't have to run anymore. The court says you stay with me now. Her brow furrowed. Like family? Daniel's throat tightened. He nodded. Yeah, like family. She studied him, measuring the truth behind the words. Then, after a long pause, she asked softly, "Can Ranger sleep in my room?" The question broke him in a way nothing else had. His chest ached, eyes stung. He pressed a hand against his mouth before answering. "Yes," he whispered. "He can sleep wherever you want. At your feet, by your side. He's yours as much as he's mine now." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close, fragile, and real. She leaned against Atlas, eyes drifting shut for the first time since Daniel had met her. Daniel watched her, the girl in the oversized hoodie, and felt the silence inside him change. No longer the silence of grief, but of possibility. Snow still drifted outside the hospital conference room, flakes catching against the glass. Inside, a whiteboard leaned against the wall, scrawled with notes from the last debrief. Files and cold coffee cups littered the table. Daniel sat at one end, posture upright despite exhaustion. Clara leaned against the window, jacket unzipped, eyes sharp but weary. Dr. Evelyn Shaw flipped through medical charts, expression calm. Mira sat cross-legged in a chair too big for her, sipping a juice box. Ranger curled at her feet. Less than 48 hours had passed since the rescue, but the question of what now hung over all of them. Daniel spoke first, voice low and steady. "We can't just walk away. That barn wasn't only Ranger. There were dozens. And there will be more." Clara pushed off the wall, pacing. "SWAT turned the site over to federal jurisdiction. But we know how that goes. Boxes, transfers, silence. The trail dies." Her frustration edged every word. She stopped, looking at him. "So what do you want? Kick doors down yourself. That nearly got you killed." Daniel shook his head. His gaze dropped to Ranger, then to Mira, and finally back to Clara. Not doors. Something lasting. A center for the dogs they broke. Ranger remembered. He came back. Others can too. Dr. Shaw set down her folder. Interest sharpening. Rehabilitation. With enough time and the right care, trauma doesn't have to be permanent. But it would take resources, space, staff, equipment. Clara crossed her arms. And money. This isn't a shelter. It's a facility. A place to rebuild what everyone else writes off as lost. Daniel's jaw tightened. Exactly. Because if we don't, they vanish into files and graves. Forgotten. Just like I thought Ranger was. The room stilled. Mira lowered her juice box slowly, eyes fixed on him. She reached down, smoothing Ranger's scarred fur. Her voice when she spoke was soft but unwavering. "So, no dog has to be forgotten again." Her words hung in the air, simple and unshakable. Daniel turned toward her, and in her two old eyes, he saw the truth of it. Hope. He nodded slowly. "That's right. Not one more." Dr. Shaw leaned back, already calculating. "I can design the medical program. Recovery phases, treatment schedules. We'd need surgical gear, kennels, therapy staff." Clara exhaled, shaking her head but smiling faintly. "I'll push the department. Some of the old ranger stations near the ridge are rotting away. Maybe one becomes ours, a haven instead of a ruin." Daniel let out a long breath, something close to peace, settling in his chest. He looked down at Mira, still stroking Ranger's fur. "We'll build it together. For them. For him." Ranger lifted his head and gave a soft whine, nudging Mira's hand as if to agree. Snow drifted against the windows, pale light filling the room. Around the table sat a cop, a doctor, a survivor, and a scarred dog breathing steady at their feet. In their silence, something new took form. Not just survival, not just escape. A mission, a promise, a future built on refusing to let hope die. The old ranger station had once been a forgotten shell, its paint peeled by winters, its windows cracked, its roof sagging under decades of snow. Now, under new hands and a new name, it had been reborn. At the entrance, a fresh oak sign stood tall. Ranger's Haven, Rehabilitation Center for Working Dogs. Beneath it, a bronze plaque caught the light, in honor of K9 Ranger, who proved that loyalty never dies. Snow clung to the pines, but inside the fences the air carried new life. Barking, not frantic, but strong. The thud of paws on frozen earth. Voices calling commands, not with cruelty, but with encouragement. The main building had been stripped and rebuilt. What once housed rangers now served as a clinic. Steel tables, stocked shelves, kennels filled not with prisoners, but patients. The old stables were converted into open runs, where dogs stretched their legs for the first time in years. The air smelled of clean straw, antiseptic, and the musk of freedom rediscovered. Daniel walked the yard, boots crunching over gravel. He took it in. A dozen dogs in recovery, staff Evelyn Shaw had recruited, and volunteers from Ironwood, people who once whispered about Fog Ridge, but now came to heal its survivors. At the head of the largest pen stood Ranger. Scars still laced his body, but his gait was strong again. His head was high, eyes alive. Other dogs clustered near him, some limping, some wary, some still shadows of themselves. But they followed him. One sharp bark and they stilled. When he ran, they ran with him. Daniel leaned against the fence, watching. "Still the leader," he murmured. Clara joined him, jacket zipped against the chill. He was never anything else. Evelyn stepped from the clinic, towel in hand. The others respond to him. He's not just recovering, he's teaching them how. Daniel's gaze softened. That's what made him mine. Mira bounded up then, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, her breath clouding in the cold. She pressed her face to the fence, eyes glowing as she watched Ranger. "He likes it here," she said firmly. Daniel crouched, hand resting on her shoulder. "So do you." Her gaze never left the pen. A timid shepherd limped forward, skeletal, hesitant. It stopped just behind Ranger, head lowered. Ranger glanced back, then nudged it forward with his nose, guiding it toward Mira. Her face lit up. She knelt, hand out. The dog sniffed, then pressed its muzzle into her palm. Mira giggled softly. "See? He's teaching them too." Daniel's chest tightened. The scars of Fog Ridge would never vanish. But here they were becoming something else. Not graves, not silence, but healing. He stood, watching them all, Ranger leading the pack, Evelyn with her charts, Clara with her sharp eyes, Mira in her oversized coat. This place wasn't just for the dogs. It was for them, too. For the first time in years, Ironwood felt alive, and at its heart stood Ranger, scarred, unbroken, imprinted. Spring came to Ironwood, and with it, Memorial Day. The courthouse steps had never looked so full. Flags snapped against the pale sky. Folding chairs lined the square, filled with townspeople bundled in coats. Veterans wore old pins. Children clutched flags. For the first time in years, Ironwood gathered not only for ghosts, but for return. At the top of the granite steps, a podium stood draped in red, white, and blue. Local officers lined the railings, hats pressed to their chests. In the center, flanked by Clara Moreno and Captain Margaret Holloway, stood Daniel Cross. His uniform was crisp again, badge gleaming in morning light. His posture was straight, but his throat tightened as he looked out across the crowd. At his side sat Ranger, bandages gone, coat full again, frame solid. A leather harness crossed his chest, simple but polished. A single tag engraved. K9 Ranger, faithful partner. When Daniel placed his hand on the Bible held by the clerk, silence fell. Even the flags seemed to pause. The judge's voice carried solemn. Daniel Cross, do you swear to uphold the duties of your office, to protect and serve the people of Ironwood, to act with honor and loyalty until the end of your watch? Daniel's chest rose. His hand trembled, then steadied. I swear. The words rang like a bell across the square. Then rise, Officer Cross, sworn again into service. Applause broke like a wave, clapping, cheers, tears streaming down weathered faces. And then Ranger lifted his head. One sharp bark. The sound cut through the applause. Pure, proud, undeniable. Not fear, not command. A vow. The crowd fell still, stunned. Then the tears came harder, voices whispering the name carved into stone a year ago. Ranger. Daniel dropped to one knee, pressing his forehead against scarred fur. Good boy, he whispered. Always. Ranger leaned into him, tail thumping once against granite. Captain Holloway's voice rang out, thick but proud. This town doesn't just have its officer back. It has its K9 back too. The applause swelled, not only for survival, but for hope reborn. As the cheers faded, a hush fell again. A smaller figure stepped forward. Mira. She wore a simple blue dress, hem brushing scuffed shoes. Clara had braided her hair, tucking a white flower behind her ear. She looked fragile against the courthouse stone, but when she faced the crowd, her eyes were steady. Daniel started forward instinctively, but she raised a hand. It's okay, she whispered. I want to say it. The microphone was lowered. The crowd leaned in. Mira's fingers twisted in her dress before she took a breath. He didn't forget us. Her voice was small but clear. She looked down at Ranger, who sat at her feet, head tilted, brown eyes fixed on her. Mira brushed his fur, grounding herself. They tried to break him, to make him forget who he was, but he didn't, because even the strongest— Her voice wavered, then steadied. Even the bravest sometimes need help to find their way home. The square went utterly still. Flags cracked in the wind. Nothing else moved. That's what Daniel did for Ranger. That's what Ranger did for me. Her eyes swept the crowd. And that's what all of you can do, for anyone who feels forgotten. Don't bury them before you know they're gone. Because sometimes they're still fighting to come back. Her words rang like a bell through the square. People shifted, tears breaking freely. A boy leaned against his father's uniformed chest, nodding solemnly. Mira hesitated, then whispered into the microphone, fragile but powerful. Hope doesn't die. It just waits for someone brave enough to carry it. She stepped back. Silence held for one beat longer. Then the sound came. Not applause at first, but sobs, murmurs, the release of a town exhaling grief too long carried. Daniel moved to her, dropping to one knee. He wrapped his arms around her slight frame, pulling her close. She pressed her face into his chest, braid brushing his uniform. And then, Ranger moved. The shepherd stepped forward, scarred body pressing against them both. He lowered his great head across Daniel's shoulder, resting it lightly over them, his breath warm, steady. His presence was undeniable, binding them together. Man, child, and dog, bound not by blood, but by survival, by loyalty, by something no collar or cage could erase. From the crowd, the first ripple of applause rose, hesitant, swelling into thunder. Flags waved, voices broke, and for one rare moment, Ironwood stood united in hope. The sunlight caught the courthouse stone, casting long shadows that wrapped around the steps like an embrace. And in that moment, the story of Ironwood was rewritten. Not just grief, not just fire, but return. Because sometimes miracles don't come in lightning or fire. Sometimes they come in fur. Sometimes in the courage of a child who refuses silence. And sometimes in refusing through snow and fog and despair to let go of hope. On the courthouse steps of Ironwood, hope stood tall again, and it had 4 legs. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand victories, but about quiet loyalty, the kind you find in the eyes of a German shepherd who refuses to give up on his partner. Dogs remind us that love isn't complicated. It's steady, it's patient, it's showing up again and again, no matter how hard the road gets. If you share your life with a dog, you already know how deep that bond runs. And if you've ever wanted to strengthen that connection, there are some beautiful resources out there. Guides and communities made by people who love dogs as much as we do. I found one recently that really touched me, and I think it could mean something to you too. If you'd like, I can share the link. No pressure, just a gentle suggestion from one dog lover to another. Because sometimes the smallest steps we take with our dogs, whether it's a new game, a walk a little longer than usual, or learning to listen to them more closely, become the moments we carry for the rest of our lives. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, let me know. I'd be glad to pass it along.